She was one of the most recognizable faces in the world, but never fully in control of what that face meant. If you've spent 20 or 30 years building a career, your name, your reputation, you know this feeling when people recognize you instantly, yet somehow miss who you've actually become. Raquel Welch didn't just rise to fame, she was shaped by it. Hollywood in the late 60s wasn't designed to give women control over their identity. It was built to define them early and keep selling that version for as long as it worked. Fame came fast. Definition came faster. Control never quite caught up. And once the world decides who you are, it rarely asks who you've become. If this resonates, stay with me and consider subscribing. Before she had control, she had already been defined. And if you've lived long enough to build something real, a career, a reputation, a name people recognize, you know how quickly that definition can settle in. There comes a point when people stop asking what you're capable of and start assuming who you are. And strangely, that moment doesn't feel like success. It feels like something closing in. That's where Raquel Welch found herself early. She didn't just become known, she became fixed. Not as a performer with range, but as a symbol the industry could easily package and sell. Her image was built for immediate impact, striking, memorable, unmistakable. But it wasn't built for evolution. It wasn't designed to grow with her. In Hollywood at the time, that wasn't an accident. It was a system. Studios invested in clarity over complexity. They promoted what could be recognized in seconds, not what needed time to be understood. Casting followed the same logic: repeat what works, reduce uncertainty. And once audiences accepted that version, the industry had no incentive to change it. So the loop closed. Her visibility kept rising. Her recognition became undeniable. But the respect tied to creative range didn't expand at the same pace. And real autonomy, the ability to shape how she was seen, remained limited. She wasn't overlooked. In fact, she was everywhere. But that was the paradox: she was being seen constantly, just not fully. And over time, that kind of recognition becomes its own constraint. Because when an image is reinforced over and over, it stops being a role and starts becoming a boundary. And when visibility becomes your identity, it's the hardest thing to escape. If you've ever felt defined by your past more than your potential, stay with me and consider subscribing. Her breakthrough didn't give her freedom, it gave the industry a template. And if you've ever had a defining moment in your career, the one that opened doors, you also know the quiet trade-off that can come with it. Sometimes the opportunity that puts you on the map is the same one that starts drawing the boundaries around you. For Raquel Welch, that moment came fast and it came clearly. Her early roles didn't just introduce her to audiences. They established a version of her that was instantly recognizable, easy to market, and highly profitable. In a business built on financial predictability, that kind of clarity wasn't just valuable, it was something to protect. So the system responded the way it always does. Repeat what sells. Reduce risk wherever possible. Reinforce what audiences already accept. And over time, that response becomes structure. It shapes casting decisions. It limits the kinds of scripts that come your way. It quietly filters out anything that doesn't match the image that's already working. In practice, that meant she wasn't being invited to explore range, she was being asked to deliver consistency. Not growth, but recognition. Not transformation, but familiarity. And the more successful that formula became, the harder it was to move beyond it. Because from the outside, nothing looked broken. The career was visible. The demand was there. The results were measurable. But inside that success, something more subtle was happening. Her options were narrowing. And that's the part that often goes unseen, especially if you've spent decades working within systems that reward what's proven over what's possible. Because repetition, over time, doesn't just reinforce identity. It begins to replace it. And repetition slowly turns recognition into limitation. If you've ever felt that tension in your own work, stay with me and consider subscribing. She wasn't just famous, she was professionally cornered. And if you've spent 20, maybe 30 years in a career, you recognize this phase when it arrives. It doesn't look like failure from the outside. In fact, it often looks like success at its peak. But internally, something shifts. Your past achievements, the very things that built your reputation, start narrowing what's possible next. What once opened doors, now quietly closes others. That's where Raquel Welch found herself. This wasn't about pressure in the usual sense. Not long hours, not competition, not the stress of staying relevant. This was deeper than that. This was structural. The kind of constraint that doesn't come from a single decision, but from an entire system working exactly as designed. She wasn't stuck by accident. She was held in place by design. The first layer was image lock-in. The more iconic she became, the more valuable that image was to protect. Studios weren't looking at her as a developing performer, they were looking at her as an asset with a proven return. And in any industry, once something generates consistent results, the priority shifts from growth to preservation. So her casting became less flexible over time, not more. Opportunities weren't expanding, they were refining toward what had already worked. And refinement, in this case, meant repetition. The second layer was the credibility gap. Despite her visibility and commercial success, critical recognition didn't follow at the same pace. And this is where the system reveals one of its quietest biases. It's not always about what you can do, it's about how the system chooses to frame what you do. She wasn't positioned for depth. She wasn't consistently placed in roles that would shift perception. And without that positioning, even strong performances struggle to redefine a career narrative. So the gap remained. Recognized, but not fully respected. Successful, but not fully validated on her own terms. And if you've ever built a career where people value your results more than your range, you understand how difficult that gap is to close. The third layer was control deficit. Real control in an industry like Hollywood doesn't just come from being visible. It comes from influence over decisions, what projects move forward, how roles are shaped, how stories are told. And for much of her career, that level of control remained limited. Contracts defined boundaries. Casting decisions were external. Narrative authority belonged to others. She was operating inside a system that knew how to maximize her visibility, but not how to expand her authorship. And that's the real tension. Success doesn't equal power. Recognition doesn't equal control over your own story. She was present everywhere, on screens, in headlines, in public memory. But rarely in full command of how that presence was constructed. And over time, that creates a very specific kind of professional reality. One where you are highly visible, yet structurally constrained. Where your name carries weight, but not necessarily direction. But this is where her career becomes more complicated. Because she didn't remain passive inside that structure. She didn't simply accept the limitations as fixed. And that's where the story shifts from being about constraint to being about response. Because the real story isn't that she was trapped. It's how she tried to push against it. She didn't accept the image, she negotiated with it. And if you've spent enough years inside any system, corporate, creative, or otherwise, you recognize that moment when something shifts internally. You stop trying to win approval from the structure and start asking a different question: how much of my direction can I take back? That's where Raquel Welch moved next. She didn't walk away from the image entirely, that wasn't realistic. Instead, she began working around it. Adjusting it. Testing how far it could stretch without breaking the recognition that still sustained her career. And those moves were intentional. She took on more serious roles, projects that demanded something beyond visual presence. She stepped into stage performances, where the audience experience is different, more immediate, less filtered by studio framing. She worked internationally, where expectations weren't always locked into the same version of her that Hollywood had established. Each of these choices pointed in the same direction, not escape through rejection, but repositioning through expansion. The strategy was clear. Reframe how she was seen. Build credibility outside the narrow lane she'd been placed in. Create a broader professional identity that could coexist with, rather than be replaced by, the original image. But this is where reality pushes back. Because in any large system, especially one as influential as Hollywood, memory doesn't update quickly. The version of you that reached millions of people doesn't just fade because you decide to evolve. It stays embedded in casting decisions, in audience expectations, in how your name is introduced before you even appear. And if you've ever tried to shift how people see you after 20 or 30 years, you know how slow that change can be. The industry takes time to adjust. The audience takes even longer. So even as she changed, the market version of Raquel Welch remained largely intact. That created a kind of split reality. On one side, she gained more say in the direction of her work. She expanded her range in meaningful ways. But on the other side, the broader perception, the one shaped years earlier, didn't fully move with her. The result wasn't failure. It was something more nuanced. Partial autonomy. Limited repositioning. But no complete reset. And that's often how real career shifts look, not dramatic reinventions, but gradual negotiations with what already exists. Because once an identity has been scaled across an entire industry, it doesn't adjust easily. If you've ever tried to redefine yourself after years of being seen a certain way, stay with me and consider subscribing. She couldn't change the system, but she could change how she lived inside it. And if you've lived through enough cycles in your career, ups, plateaus, reinventions, you eventually come to this realization. Control doesn't always look like rewriting the rules. Sometimes, it looks like stepping back and deciding what is no longer worth chasing. Because not every battle leads to freedom. And not every opportunity leads to clarity. For Raquel Welch, this phase wasn't about breaking out anymore. It was about redefining what control actually meant within the limits that remained. And that distinction matters. This wasn't defeat. It was recalibration. Instead of continuing to push against a system that had already defined her at scale, she began to shift her focus inward toward what she could actually shape. She became more selective with roles, choosing projects that aligned more closely with her own standards rather than external expectations. She leaned into personal branding on her own terms, how she presented herself, how she maintained her presence, how she engaged with the public beyond the narrow image she had been given early on. And perhaps most importantly, she prioritized longevity, not through dramatic reinvention, but through consistency and self-direction. Because by that point, the goal had changed. It was no longer about forcing the world to see her differently overnight. It was about maintaining a version of herself that felt true, even if the broader perception didn't fully catch up. That's a quieter kind of control, but a more sustainable one. And if you've spent decades working, you understand how significant that shift is. There comes a time when being constantly re-evaluated by others matters less than being internally aligned with your own decisions. So her strategy pivoted. From trying to change perception to owning presence. And that's not a small move, it's a fundamental one. Because when you stop asking to be re-seen, you reclaim energy. When you stop chasing validation, you regain direction. She stopped trying to correct the image at scale and started defining herself within it. Not perfectly, not completely, but intentionally. And over time, that intention becomes its own form of authority. Because real control doesn't always arrive at the height of success. More often, it comes later, after the system has shown you its limits and you've learned where your own begin. Because real control often comes later than success. Her legacy isn't what she was given, it's what she managed to preserve. And if you've lived long enough, worked 20, 30, maybe 40 years, you begin to see your career differently. It's no longer just about milestones or recognition. It becomes something more personal. You start asking a quieter question: how much of me is still intact after all of this? Because a career doesn't just build you. It also shapes you, sometimes in ways you didn't choose. Raquel Welch's legacy isn't built on dominance. She didn't control the industry. She didn't continuously reinvent herself every few years to stay ahead of it. What she represents instead is something less visible, but more familiar to most people. Endurance under constraint. She stayed present in an industry that had already defined her early. She continued working within a system that never fully adjusted to her range. And over time, she learned how to operate inside those limits without completely losing herself to them. That's not the kind of legacy that gets simplified into headlines. But it's the kind that resonates, especially if you've spent decades navigating expectations, roles, and identities that didn't always evolve with you. Her legacy lives in that tension. Seen, but not fully understood. Celebrated, but not fully empowered. Persistent, despite structural limits she didn't create. And that's exactly why her story connects with a 45-plus audience. Because at this stage of life, the conversation shifts. It's no longer about how quickly you rise. It's about how you sustain. How you adapt without disappearing. How you continue without becoming a version of yourself you no longer recognize. Not the fame. Not the image. But the long negotiation with identity over time. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Because in the end, success is rarely the full story. Titles, recognition, visibility, they're measurable, but they're not complete. Control is harder to measure. And often, harder to reach. Most people spend years, even decades, trying to catch up to it, trying to align what they've built with who they actually are. And if there's a lesson here, it's not about avoiding the system. It's about understanding it early and deciding what you're willing to trade and what you're not. Because the longer the road gets, the clearer it becomes. What you keep matters just as much as what you achieve. If this perspective resonates with you, stay with the channel and consider subscribing.